Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. This is Matt Schultz. I'm the program manager for the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance, and I'd like to welcome you to our second in our Sustainable Phosphorus Webinar Series, our second episode. This one is entitled Promises and Perils of Water Quality Trading. And we're going to be talking about water quality trading programs today with both Victoria Pebbles, who's the program director from the Great Lakes Commission, and Doug Myers, who's the Maryland senior scientist from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. If you could please keep yourselves muted during the course of the webinar, and also keep your video off. That will make sure that we have a less distracting meeting, and we'll also ensure that we don't overload our bandwidth. A few instructions in addition to those. At any point during the webinar, you can feel free to submit questions via the chat feature. And if you look in your main window for the Zoom program that you've launched to get into this webinar, and you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see a little ribbon. It's on the bottom of mine. I think in some people it might be at the top of their screen, but you'll see a little ribbon that has mute, stop video, and a few other features. Mine may look slightly different than yours, but you just want to make sure that you're muted and your video is off. But there's also should be a chat button that you can hit, and it will open a chat dialog box, as you see to the right here. And in that dialog box, you can select who you want to send your chat to. If you send those questions to me, Matthew Schultz, you can just type your message and hit send, and I'll get those. You can, if you want, send a chat out to everyone, but it's likely you probably don't want to do that. So please be aware that your selection will determine who gets your chat. And if you're cut off from the program at any point, please just go into the original email. I sent a reminder email yesterday that has the Zoom login information, and you can just re-log in from that. And hopefully that will get you back in. So a little bit about us, the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance. We're a member-funded multi-stakeholder nonprofit, and we advocate for the sustainable use, recovery, and recycling of phosphorus in the food system. And you can see here a list of our illustrious founding members and partners who've been involved with this effort. We would love to recruit more people to the table. And if anyone is interested in finding out more information about how they can participate in the Alliance, please do contact me at the email listed below. This webinar is going to be, is being recorded, and it will be placed on YouTube in the coming weeks. So you can get any of this information from the webinar by going to our YouTube channel at the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance. Just one announcement before we begin. We just had in May an event called Phosphorus Form 2017 in Washington, D.C. We're having our next one in February. So those of you who are in cold climates get to come to Tempe, Arizona, where it should be nice and warm in February, to spend a day with us discussing phosphorus sustainability issues. We're still developing the agenda, but you can keep tabs on this by going to the events page of our website, and we'll have more information updates as they become available. Registration is already open, and you can even book a hotel room now if you'd like to. So with that, a bit about the agenda. We're in the middle of the introduction now. We're going to have two presentations. The first, Doug is going to talk about the Chesapeake Bay program. Then Victoria is going to talk mostly about her Fox River P program, and then some about the Erie P program as well. And then the three of us will have a bit of discussion, and then we'll open it up to the questions that you've submitted via chat during the talk. So with that, I can give a bit of background on what we're talking about today. Before we start, we're getting a little background noise. I'm going to mute one person. Just as a reminder, if you could please keep yourselves muted during the webinar, that would be great. So what is water quality trading? That would be a good question to start with. So it's a system that allows companies, farms, others who might generate a particular pollutant to reduce that pollutant output to a level that they generate credits. In other words, they want to reduce their emissions below some threshold value that's established by regulation. And in doing so, they obtain credits that they can trade on a market. And this market allows for organizations or companies or other entities who are emitting pollutants to reduce the cost of their pollution abatement. For some people, it's cheaper to reduce a marginal level of pollution than it is for others, and that disparity in price forms the basis of the market and allows various traders to trade their credits. And so we'll hear a little bit more about the mechanics of how that works from Doug and Victoria today. But the idea is really to produce a more efficient system for reducing pollution in particular watersheds. And they're fairly prevalent programs. This map has been produced by Kaiser and Associates, and they were nice enough to allow us to show it here today. And you can see that there are various water trading quality programs all across the country in different states of development. The orange triangles on the map all represent projects that are already being piloted or also represent permit-specific trading projects that exist. And you can see there's dozens, probably 60 or 70 just in the US. If you look up in Canada, you're probably pushing more towards 100 in the northern part of North America. So this is a prevalent system for dealing with water quality issues, and we'll hear from our speakers today. So without further ado, our speakers again are Doug Myers and Victoria Pebbles. And Doug, I'm going to start with you, and I've got a bio here that I'm going to read before you start. So Doug Myers is the Maryland Senior Scientist for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and has been since 2013. Doug has a Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology from Millersville University in Pennsylvania and an MS in Environmental Science from University of Houston, Clear Lake in Texas. He spent his career in diverse fields and locations such as fisheries and marine mammal biology in the Bering Sea, environmental education and coastal resource management on the Texas Gulf Coast, and excuse me, and wetlands policy and coastal habitat restoration in the Puget Sound for forage fish species, salmon, and endangered southern resident orcas. Since coming to the foundation, Doug reviews and advises on policies affecting the health of the Chesapeake Bay's waters and species, especially from agriculture, stormwater runoff, and the navigational dredging sectors. Doug, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that you can share yours. However, give me just a second because I'm suddenly not seeing the...
So I've already instituted my share
you've already
screen,
done it.
so
Okay,
yeah,
great.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Again, my name is Doug Myers, Maryland Senior Scientist. Just for some background in the way Chesapeake Bay Foundation runs its operations is we have senior scientists in each of the state offices in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, as well as some headquarters overall watershed scientists. So we try to engage at the appropriate levels of government for policies that are affecting Chesapeake Bay through that structure. Oh, there it goes. Do you see that?
Yeah, we see it, Doug. Thanks.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So we're kind of at the point where we need to do trading in the Chesapeake Bay in order to meet the cleanup goals. My favorite saying is that we've picked and canned and preserved all the low-hanging fruit that can be done cheaply and efficiently, but we still have a ways to go. And we need to look at moving forward. This is our third phase of what we call the Watershed Implementation Plan of nutrient removal that's shared by 6 states in the District of Columbia. And I'm showing a late August 2009 picture of the dead zone, just so you can see how big that is. The nutrient enrichment problem we have in the bay. It's nice to know that this last 3 years, we have not had any completely anoxic waters. So that's a turning point, we think, especially when it comes to phosphorus availability, because any even small amount of dissolved oxygen on the bottom is going to allow those phosphorus molecules to stay bound to their sediment particles and not be reabsorbed back into the water column where they can drive plankton blooms. So we're very excited about reaching that threshold. Why Maryland is so important in this is you can see from the Bay watershed model kind of the breakdown of phosphorus pollution in the Bay by source. Agriculture is certainly the largest source, and there's no regulatory programs that will directly reduce phosphorus discharges. We do have a legacy on the eastern shore of Maryland, the Delmarva Peninsula, where many years of poultry industry and the use of poultry litter as a fertilizer has resulted in saturation of soils. And so Maryland has embarked on a very ambitious program to begin to reduce that saturation over time, some of which will be phased in a regulatory approach, and others which will still require voluntary incentives, and the trading program could be one of those. A little background on how phosphorus is a problem is these red areas of the watershed, because both of their proximity to the bay and the kinds of land uses that generate phosphorus runoff are highlighted in red. So on the western shore, the left side of your photograph, it's the cities, the developed areas along the I-95 corridor, but in Pennsylvania, the northern section of the map, and then on the eastern shore, Delmarva Peninsula, you have close proximity to tidal waters and very heavy animal agriculture. The other problem with phosphorus is that it's pretty persistent. We've decided where we need to be in the 2017 timeframe, which is halfway through the Bay cleanup, and 2025, where we need to ultimately get. But where we are right now is kind of up here. There's quite a few 100,000 pounds to go. The total allowable phosphorus in the Bay is 12.5 million pounds based on the Bay model, water quality model. USGS has been looking at long and short-term trends of those loads by looking at the effective weather and delivery of loads from runoff, and shown most of the watersheds are improving, except for the Chop Tank, which is a representative watershed from that lower eastern shore, Delmarva Peninsula area, where we have both long and short-term trends in degrading phosphorus loads. So still lots of work to do in certain areas that are disproportionately affecting the Bay for the map above. So in general, we went into, and I'm highlighting Maryland's program because it's probably the most sophisticated. It will be statewide. It'll occur across multiple sectors. Virginia and Pennsylvania's programs are a little less developed and have not really become fully implemented, even though they have had programs on the books for a number of years. But the Chesapeake Bay Agreement has a 40% reduction goal for nutrients that has been fully met. In order to accomplish trading, simply striving for this minimum reduction is not adequate, obviously, or our water quality would have improved by now. And the concept of meeting baseline becomes very important. This is basically saying that every sector needs to do its fair share to try to get to those load reduction goals that are assigned to them. And you can see how the various states are doing in the program toward those goals at this 2017 midpoint. So the environmental community has been very active in helping to shape this policy because we've heard some of the shorthand stories of nutrient trading being a permission to pollute, and we really didn't want our program to be a paper program that accomplished that and made the industry feel better that they were doing something, because credits were changing hands, but no actual load reduction to the bay was happening. So we inserted ourselves very early into this process. And part of the checks and balances of the trading program is to make sure that they're attached to a permit program. And therefore, the use of credits for meeting a regulatory requirement becomes mandatory in that permit. And so that the credits that are traded into that permit are real and verifiable. We have played around with other models for doing nutrient trading that were just kind of industry driven and market driven, and nobody felt very confident that those were going to result in real load reductions. And then the state regulatory and permitting programs will then have some checks and balances through the Bay program itself, in that best management practices are verified on a regular basis as part of the Chesapeake Bay cleanup by the states and then reported to EPA. We had a big concern about how widely geographies can be trading. If you had within the western shore of Maryland, for example, load reductions needed for a stormwater MS4 permit, and the only available credits were coming from across the bay, we felt that that was kind of an inappropriate trading geography. So we put some protections into the letter of the regulation to say that if there's a local impairment of nitrogen, phosphorus, or sediment within that watershed, that Huck 8 watershed, then your traded credits must originate from upstream. So these local water quality impairments need to be addressed first, realizing that once that's done, those are also load reductions to the bay itself. And so that language kind of precludes folks from trading really broadly if there's a local impairment, but if you're just contributing load reductions for the bay itself from anywhere in the watershed, that those pounds, if there's not a local impairment, could be traded more universally and support a larger market. And so that was a compromise between the environmental community and the would-be trading profiteers to be able to have a system that works for everybody. So Maryland's current program, not designed to assess the effectiveness of a nutrient trading program on its face. So we are going to be relying on the Bay program and its assessment of BMP efficiencies and verification of BMPs to happen, but they're still in negotiation for the final part of the regulation. At least annual verification of a representative number of practices that are being relied upon for trading, that they are meeting their efficiencies. We do have the advantage of the Chesapeake Bay of having a lot of sciences gone into the water quality model and understanding the effectiveness of BMPs as they're implemented. We're only allowing practices to enter into the trading program that already have model efficiencies associated with them in the Chesapeake Bay model. So it's not easy for folks to just make up some new, better mousetrap way to reduce pounds of nitrogen and phosphorus and get credits for those. They have to have gone through that rigorous process of being approved by the Chesapeake Bay program. So to conclude, nutrient trading is an important tool in the toolbox, and we're anxious to get it started because we think it's the only way we're going to make the schedule from 2017 to 2025 in certain sectors to be able to reduce the loads. I think the stormwater load in particular is problematic because of the extraordinary cost per pound reduction in that sector. And we do have not only a very large agricultural land base, but a generalized need to reduce the phosphorus loads from that land base while making it a cost-effective and bottom line for the farmer thing to do. Right now, they currently get, for example, cover crop payments from the state. If you were able to switch that revenue source to have the nutrient trading program cover parts of the cover crop program, that would free up additional state money for other best management practices and agricultural cost share program, with the net effect of larger overall load reductions. So the environmental community will remain constantly involved as this goes from a draft regulation, which it is right now. It's going out for public comment in the next few weeks. And I think Maryland's program will be a model for the rest of the watershed, the rest of the country, actually, on how to do this right, how to be protective and still maintain a good market balance so that the trading program moves forward.
Great, Doug. Thanks so much for that presentation. And again, if anyone in the audience has questions, please do submit them via the Zoom chat feature. And we'll get to those at the end when we have questions and answers. We're going to first go into straight into Victoria Pebbles' presentation on the Fox P and Erie P programs. And I'd like to start with a brief bio of Victoria before she starts. So Victoria Pebbles is program director with the Great Lakes Commission, where she facilitates multidisciplinary project teams to address complex ecological and socioeconomic challenges facing the Great Lakes region. She currently leads the GLC's water quality and water infrastructure programs to address water quality issues in urban, rural, and watershed-wide settings, and help deliver clean water infrastructure and services that supports a safe and sustainable water supply across the Great Lakes region. Ms. Pebbles holds an MS from the University of Michigan and an environmental leadership certificate from UC Berkeley. Victoria has held previous positions with the University of Michigan, the US Senate, and the US EPA. Over the past 25 years, she's published dozens of articles and reports, delivered copious presentations, and served on numerous advisory groups addressing environmental policy, science, and management. And Victoria, I would just like to add to that I would be much more impressed by your credentials if you had gone to my alma mater of University of Illinois instead of University of Michigan, but we're still glad to have you here today.
Thanks, Matt. Unfortunately, I couldn't be in two places at one time in grad school, but I do collaborate a lot with University of Illinois and many other wonderful regional institutions across the Great Lakes Basin and beyond, as evidenced by today's webinar. So thank you, Matt, and thank you everyone else for joining today, and hopefully the information I share with you will be of use to you. So I'm going to talk mostly about Fox P trade, but I'm going to touch on Erie P Market, and if you want to know more during the discussion, I can elaborate on either of them. So let's start with the Fox P trade. Before I do that, just by way of background, the Great Lakes Commission is a binational organization that represents the interests of the 8 states and 2 provinces that border the Great Lakes. We are founded in federal and state law on the US side of the border, and we work closely with many stakeholders from different sectors. Just a bit of background about who we are. So on the Fox P trade front, this project, I'm trying to advance my slides, there we go. This slide shows both projects, and I'm just going to quickly touch on the Erie P Market on the right is a framework under development in a multi-jurisdictional setting, which includes many states, and is building off of a program that some of you familiar trading may have heard of called the Ohio River Basin Trading Project, which to my understanding is the only multi-jurisdictional, multi-state trading project as a pilot in the country. And Fox P trade is the one I'm going to focus most of my attention on for the balance of my remarks. And that is quite different in that it's focused on a watershed that is solely within the state of Wisconsin. Well, you might ask, why was the Great Lakes Commission focused on a singular state? And really it was so we could try to test the program there and bring lessons learned to other applications across the basin, and Erie P Market indeed grew out of that. So a little bit of background on the watershed in the Lower Fox. It's 641 square miles, and it's comprised roughly of these 14 Huck 12s that you see here. And similar to what Doug was saying, even though we say it has a single TMDL, and it does have a single TMDL, that TMDL actually applies to, can be broken down into 14 distinct watersheds, each with their own water quality objectives. So just by way of example, you can trade in between these HUC 12s under this trading program, but you get dinged, or you have a higher trade ratio, which is called delivery factor under the Wisconsin program. The Great Lakes Commission was brought in after the guidance was already approved. The state wrote the guidance. We did not write it. The state DNR wrote it. The state also passed statutory authority to enable trading. Also, the state established numeric criteria for phosphorus. So it was kind of a perfect trifecta. Plus, they had state ag performance standards. So what's the ag threshold? So all of this together led one to believe, and us to believe too, that, wow, you couldn't ask for a more compelling suite of drivers to stand up a trading program. So we were called in by the request of the USDA and RCS in Wisconsin to help set up and test the program. So all of these mechanisms were already in place. It's also important to note that the Lower Fox is one of 4 priority watersheds under the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. It's a sort of a sister program to the Chesapeake Bay Restoration Program. There are differences, but I'll leave it at that. So that's a little background about the drivers. And then, so moving on from the drivers, a little bit more about like what kinds of areas are we talking about. So about 35% urban, 15% natural areas, but heavily agriculture. As you can see by the orange in the map on the right. Not only do you have multiple counties, but you also have a tribal authority, which is seen, if you can follow my cursor, this roughly rectangular shape in the upper left-hand portion of the map. So that overlaps with several sub-watersheds, but they're also an independent nation. So that adds a layer of jurisdictional complexity. 29 MS4s and 15 CAFOs at the time. There might be 1 or 2 more since I did this slide. So what's the issue we're dealing with? So the guidance that came out that was approved by EPA for trading allowed the state to trade for phosphorus, to trade for a variety of pollutants, but our focus was initially on the 2 that were identified in the TMDL, TSS, total suspended solids, and total phosphorus. As we started to dig in on it, we really ended up focusing solely on phosphorus. Our framework that we set up allows for it to be applied for TSS, but as those of you in the trading world may appreciate, the models for calculating those and determining the actual amount of reductions are different for phosphorus and suspended solids. And since we were also charged with setting up the framework, the documents, the transactional process and the supporting documentation, we really just focused heavily on phosphorus. Again, although the framework can be applied for TSS. So this is an infographic that we made when we delved into it, realizing that it's a pretty complicated thing, trading is. And how does it work in this case? Well, you can't just jump in just because they're drivers, because permitted facilities really need to understand what their compliance needs are, and that trading offers an alternative. And if you don't know how much it's going to cost to upgrade using bricks and mortar, you're not going to be a very good candidate for determining whether trading is a cost-effective compliance option for you. So there's some homework that needs to be done there, and then you can kind of follow this tree. But we took a relatively complicated transaction, really tried to boil it down to its essence so that we could make it as simple as possible. Mind you, that if you looked at the Wisconsin DNR's trading guidance, well, very well thought out, but it was really about how the permit holder could comply with the DNR rules. It didn't really spell out how the permit holder and the agricultural entity, the buyer and the seller, how their transaction worked. So we really honed in on that piece. We generated 2 primary products from this. One is the foxptrade.org website, and another is a handbook that really steps, whether you're a buyer or a seller, steps you through the process. These are complementary. The handbook is sort of old school. You can print it out, you can turn pages and reference it. And the ptrade.org is a website that really allows you to navigate and jump around using the internet, which a lot of people prefer these days. So without further ado, I'm going to bring over the website and just demonstrate for you quickly what this looks like. Matt, can you tell me if folks are seeing the screen that says the foxptrade.org?
We are seeing the slide that says that, I think, Victoria, but not the web browser.
Okay, let me just try this one more time. New share. Do you see it now?
Yes.
Okay,
now we see
thank
it.
you. Thanks, sorry for the technical glitch there. So this you can see is just sort of the landing page, if you will. So it speaks to both, you can see screens with a more urban setting, screens with a more agricultural setting, and then invites you to learn more or go places deeper, depending on whether you're a buyer or seller. I'm just gonna walk through how to for buyers for a real quick moment, just to show you what we're talking about here. So if you're a buyer and you come in, meaning a permit holder, you want to see if this is a compliance option for you, you scroll down here and you first have to do a little homework, as I mentioned. You should know what your pollution reduction requirements are, how much it will cost if you were to do bricks and mortar or traditional technologies, or and then really kind of have that, whether if you think your costs are too high, whether this is an option. And then it really walks you through several simple steps. So this is a very concise version of what's in the trading document, this text on the right. And then in parallel on the left, this says, here's the section of the handbook where you could go to for more detailed text. Here's entities you can talk to help you with this step. And it walks you through each step along the way. You can see if you complete step 1, you're about 16% through the process. Say you're done, you click on step 2. You submit a notice of intent. Wisconsin's program requires you let the regulatory agency know that. You submit that. You move on to step 3. You sign a trade agreement. Well, one of the things that we developed is a series of templates that can support trades. So if you scroll down here, you can actually open up your contract template and say, what does a contract look like? What do I need to do? So here we try to keep these very simple. They're modifiable to accommodate individual circumstances, but names, recitals, and importantly, how much are you reducing? You have to attach your certification report for the quantification model that you use. In short, you have to prove that you're actually making the reductions that you say you are through showing your modeling results. What are the terms of payment? Timing and verification. Verification is key. Doug spoke to that. A number of other provisions here, making sure that both parties agree and dealing with the very important what if. What if weather knocks out my cover crop? What if my cover crop doesn't stick? What if? So there's those provisions in here. But I'm really happy to say that at the end of the day, relatively short contract. It's 8 pages plus a signature page. And so that is an example of one of the documents that we've created. We also have a verification form and a verification agreement and a number of other supporting documents that support each step along the way. So you have a trade agreement, then you have to submit your packet, which is like the agreement without the money part, to the regulatory agency. You've done that, you move on to step 5, and then you have to again install the practices, and then say, hey, Wisconsin DNR, we've installed these. Here's the information of how they're going to get verified. And then finally, annually, you have to, as a buyer, submit an annual credit verification report. So again, each step along the way, very brief language on the web page, which tells who should do this step, a complimentary link to the more detailed instructions in the handbook, and then forms or documentations or templates that you might need to support that step. In this case, for this last step, a template for, you can download it, a PDF or a Word version of the verification report. So that's the how-to for buyers. I don't have time to go into the sellers. There's also a documents library, an FAQ, and who to contact. I will let you guys know that even though we created this, we have since handed it over to a regional watershed organization that is based in the Lower Fox. So they now continue to maintain this and continue to execute and work with buyers and sellers in that watershed. So our work with them is completed in terms of setting that up. Now I'm going to try to go back to my slides, and I think that might be my last slide.
I believe that is your last slide too, Victoria.
Okay, so hopefully I did that in the 15 minutes.
You did fabulously.
And, thank you very much. Back to you, Matt.
Great, thanks. If you could unshare your screen, then I can take over the screen share here. And okay, great. We're going to now have just a little discussion among the three of us, and then we've got some questions that have come in via the chat as well. So we'll get to those right after. Remind everyone, if you could please make sure that you're muted. We're having some background noise from at least one caller. And so, okay, let's go ahead and have a bit of discussion here. So I'll kick us off with a question, I guess to both of you, but you know, we had a provocative speech at our Phosphorus Forum in DC in May from Steve Rowe from Nutrient, in which he sort of drew comparisons between the water quality trading programs in the country and our air quality trading programs. And one of the things he brought up in that discussion was that we have these very robust regional national markets for air quality trading that I think most people would say have been fairly successful at dampening our air pollution. But our water quality trading programs tend to be very piecemeal. They're small. They tend to only involve a few trades here and there, and haven't really had the same impact on water quality that the analogous programs in air quality have. So I'm wondering if each of you can maybe address why haven't we gotten to the same point with air quality or with water quality as we have with air quality, and what are the challenges, and is there an opportunity to build broader and more robust markets?
I can start with that if you want this, Doug. I think there's a couple differences. One is the medium itself between air and water. Air goes immediately up into the atmosphere. Yes, there's a localized air shed, but it much more quickly becomes, the pollutant much more quickly becomes a global pollutant within the atmosphere. Pollutants into water tend to stay more localized within those watersheds. And we have an entire practice under the Clean Water Act of using the 303D list and making lists of impaired water bodies. And so it's kind of set up an entire regulatory framework that is inherently local. And so this is why the environmental community, for purposes of social justice, the idea of just trading pounds of pollution to water over huge distances has the potential to continue to make certain local dirty waters dirtier with questionable benefits more broadly.
Okay, and Victoria, do you have anything you'd add to that?
Sure, I will echo that. Yeah, it's there's the market is shared and it's global. The market and when you're talking about air, I'm not a air quality trading expert, but my familiarity is it's not air, it's carbon. And I know there have been some maybe atmospheric nitrogen. But I think in water, similarly, it's not water quality, it's specific things. It's phosphorus, it's sediment, sometimes it's temperature. So you can't, there are equivalency factors that in the trading lexicon that we discuss. So different programs drive for particular pollutants or parameters, and you can't always trade one for the other. So it's not all water is the same. But so that's one point, and to Doug's point, the scale of the market is very local with water, whereas it's not so with air.
And just to, I guess, follow up on the point, as we start building water quality trading networks, like the Fox River, and then you can begin to scale that up, then adjacent areas with similar regulatory requirements can start connecting each other over larger geographies. So step one in the Chesapeake was to have each of the states develop their own programs. But take, for example, the Potomac River, which goes right between Virginia and Maryland. There's no reason why, ultimately, if you can get the standards aligned between the two state regulatory programs, that a water quality impact in the Maryland section of the Potomac River couldn't be offset by the a load reduction somewhere on the Potomac side of the river upstream. So that would be our first foray into interstate trading, but we couldn't do it until each of the existing state programs were developed and equivalencies were acknowledged between those two programs. Ultimately, the Chesapeake Bay program also requires staying below that cap. So our 12.5 million pounds of phosphorus is all we're ever going to be able to put into the bay. So any new loads, we're going to have to be offset across the watershed. So that is why we need to get the trading mechanics put together first, which will help with complying with existing permits and accelerating existing load reductions. But the mechanism's best manifestation will be in helping us stay below the cap, because those offsets will have to be traded across larger geographies. And by that time, like the post 2025, when we're finished with the TMDL, in order to stay below the cap, we may be in an interstate trading framework.
Yeah, so it's interesting, Doug. You're basically, it sounds like what you're arguing is that rather than having a top-down approach for building these markets, you sort of build them from the grassroots, sort of one small watershed at a time, and connect them and build your larger markets that way.
And I think you just have to, because of the regulatory structure for water under the Clean Water Act versus Clean Air Act.
Yeah, I would just say that, Doug, though, maybe you've built it, in terms of starting with smaller trade geographies as you've done, and certainly that's as well with the lower Fox, and you could build it out. But I would say that you have this overarching driver, this cap that's set by the TMDL.
Right.
And so that's pretty significant. And by way of example, when we've took the lessons learned from the Fox P and we migrated them over to the Western Lake Erie Basin, which includes 3 states and the province of Ontario. Now we have targets. There's a 40% reduction and there's a mean concentration value and a pound of spring load. So there are end targets, but the allocation process of which country and which watersheds actually have to reduce by X amount have not yet been agreed to. Those will be forthcoming in what's called a domestic action plan. But because we're dealing with a binational system, the construct of a TMDL is uniquely a province of the U.S. Clean Water Act. But I just think that in following up, I think, yes, building that, starting at the smaller level where you can ensure that any trade does not impair a local water body. But at the same time, when you move to larger areas, you can have that endpoint, like with Chesapeake Bay, your endpoint is to improve the bay. Western Lake Erie is to improve the Western Lake Erie watershed. So multi-jurisdictional can be if you agree on the methods and you agree on the way that the load reductions are calculated and there's transparency and confidence in those models.
Right.
And
So
you have a very well-developed model that's very well respected and accepted in the Chesapeake.
Right. So just to explain to people how that works is it's based on land area and land uses. So the total land area of the watershed in each state and the accompanying land uses determine both the load that's allocated to that state for reduction as well as the sector loads for reduction. So each land use, if it's agricultural land use, then that load for that many acres goes to that sector to reduce. And keeping those sectors in place and requiring those sector-specific load reductions helps to get trading started, because if you just all defaulted to, for example, wastewater treatment plant efficiency, we're currently meeting our 2017 target for phosphorus, at least in the wastewater sector. But as we grow our population and we begin to approach the capacity of those plants, we'll no longer be able to pick up the slack. And so having those other sectors participate will be crucial in order to keep on track.
Okay, great. I guess you mentioned one of the questions I have too is about how you're quantifying these loads. So there seems to be, from discussions I've had with people who are modeling phosphorus transport, not a lot of confidence in some of these models, and I might even say all of the models. And there seems to be quite a bit of disagreement about whether there's which model's best, and results can be inconsistent and inaccurate. And I'm wondering, how do you capture that when you're building a trading market, the uncertainty that you find in the modeling that you're doing for quantification?
Well, we have to start with realizing all models are wrong, but some are useful, and that they always get improved over time. So for the Chesapeake Bay model, we're approaching version 6.0, which means they've learned a lot in what they had wrong with the previous models. One of the things they're doing for this last version is to incorporate the concept of phosphorus saturation in agricultural soils, which was not very well addressed in previous versions of the model. So you don't get hung up on that. What we have done, though, is to make the actual trades easier, is the development of site-specific, smaller-scale tools based on that model, and realizing that those tools will develop with the big model to be able to say, what is this farm's share of the nitrogen or phosphorus load to the bay, the delivered load. You can calculate that at the scale of a single farm. You can find out whether that farm is meeting baseline, which would be their contribution to the overall load reduction for the sector. And then everything above and beyond that baseline is tradable credits. So it would be very difficult to do this without a model that can quantify the load reduction that comes from the installation of BMPs. That's an agreed upon level of science. You saw from Victoria's tool, they have the documentation in the form for which model you use to predict your load reductions, and that those are verified. That's a crucial part of any trading program. If you're doing this only on paper and without verification and some confidence in the models, it's just not going to work.
Victoria, do you have anything to add to that, or?
Sure. I will say that the confidence in the models depends on which parameters you're modeling and the experience in your watershed, whether people know that model or not. So in the case of Fox P trade, the guidance that was established by the Wisconsin DNR set forth the preferred model for ag and for phosphorus as SNAP Plus, which the state is a state variation on Russell 2. So the different models, that would not be an appropriate model for modeling reductions from an urban BMP, for example, for TSS, by the way, either. So it's phosphorus and ag specific, edge of field, and it did deal with both total and the dissolved fraction to a certain extent. Fairly complicated model. So the uncertainties were dealt with in Wisconsin through trade ratios and a rather complex trade ratio that had, it was actually rather a trade ratio index. So there were 4 elements to it. One was uncertainty, and then there were other, you could get, the ratio could go higher and higher depending on whether you were outside the Huck 12 or you had an upstream downstream trade. But these trade ratios are inherently designed to accommodate the uncertainty in modeling. But I would say that for the ag side, in terms of modeling, there is a promising tool that was developed by USDA, ARS, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, called the Nutrient Tracking Tool. And it was initially developed to support trading years ago, and then it kind of got shelved and housed in a university for a few years. And it's now been reclaimed by USDA, and they're trying to really calibrate it for major watersheds across the United States. So it is the go-to tool for calculating edge of field reductions and can support all kinds of trading programs. Now, that I would set the Chesapeake Bay aside because you guys have spent 10 years, improving, and now you're on version 6, so you've got your model down. But for those who are coming into this trading space and may not have a ready model or they don't know which model, I would say my recommendation is, get it calibrated for your region, because it benefits us all when we have one tool that people can rely on, and we can continue to improve that tool and calibrate it for the watersheds. my final point on this confidence is the models themselves are one tool in the trading schematic toolbox and Doug mentioned this. Verification is very important, and so that's more of a transactional process, but they go hand in hand, right? The modeling is what you anticipate to be, and then you verify that those practices are performing. And then, and although not required, some trading programs do have run monitoring programs alongside them to help them recalibrate models along the way.
Okay, great, thanks. You know, we've got a few questions that have come in via the chat, so I think I'm going to move over to some of those and we can come back to discussing other points as they emerge. But I'm going to actually do something that's probably dangerous and try something new while we're here online. So I'm going to try to put the questions up here in this box so everyone can read them. And I assume you can all see this. The first question is, what is the envisioned cost of a credit? Will this vary across the watersheds? Will credits become more expensive the more you purchase? And I think the last one is also, what are the units of P allocated per credit? Does someone want to field that?
I can start. The cost of a credit is a completely market-driven concept. Those of us working into developing the policies around trading have been very careful to not step into that realm because it's really a free market concept, and we think allowing it to stay that way makes trading work better than if there was any kind of a price fixing in the cost. What's being used for guidance in somebody who has credits to sell is they're going to look at those costs, just like Victoria's website showed. What is your current cost of compliance? Folks who hold a permit know exactly what that is, or they have a really good idea. And whatever the market will bear in what's being sold, the smart sellers of credits will also know how much that buyer is currently spending, and they're going to bid on that price to try to capture that sale. So the dynamics of that are really hard to say until you start seeing a credit market take place. I'll let Victoria explain how well credit prices are developing in that existing program. It should not vary a lot across watersheds unless there's any particular real estate price that's involved in some of the BMPs. We do see some extremely high real estate prices in urban areas of the watershed. So this actually works in the favor of credit pricing for the agricultural sector, because the price of doing an agricultural BMP on an existing farm is usually way less than buying the land or using the land in an urban setting for water quality practice. And then finally, we've just chosen pounds for both nitrogen and phosphorus, and tons for suspended sediment as the unit.
So I'll just build on that a little bit. I think the question is perhaps what is the price of a credit? And I think it's really important to think about cost versus price. Let's say you're going to buy a house. You're going to pay a price for that house. That price may not be what it costs to build the house. Maybe you can build the house for $50,000, but you buy it for $100,000. And so let's talk about what are the costs that go into generating a credit. So there's the cost of the BMP. Those can be, I think, as Doug alluded to, they can be similar in a watershed. What does it cost to install fencing and engineering practice or a cover crop? And then there's the sort of transactional costs, right? Like, are you engaging a broker? Does that broker cost a fee? Is there a verifier fee? Somebody who actually comes back as part of the trade deal. These are all the transaction fees. Is there the price that whoever does your modeling for you? We call that a kind of a certification. Are those built? So those might all be pieces that go into the total cost of bringing a credit to the market, right? And then the price is what is paid. So maybe once you pay the broker and the cost of the BMP to the farmer, maybe the farmer wants a little margin in case something, or maybe they're generating more, they're engaging in more practices than are the minimum, so they have a margin of safety in case something fails. So this is getting rather technical, but I think it's important. The takeaway here is there's the cost of what goes into generating the credit, and then there's the price that the credit is sold for on the market. And Doug is correct that that only becomes cost effective if that you can add that up and it's less than what is there. Let me give you an example of how we did this. We modeled 3 different farms in the Lower Fox, and they were actually quite varied, and partly because the US EPA guidance on trading says that you have to achieve your TMDL threshold first before you can generate long-term permanent credits. And so in some of the watersheds for the Lower Fox under the TMDL, those reductions were like 86%. So for that additional reduction to those farms who've already achieved that, those were going to be really expensive to generate those. As opposed to, let's say you took that out of a TMDL construct and you could start with the baseline of wherever you are now and you didn't have to hit the TMDL threshold, you might be able to generate credits at a much more cost-effective, cheaper cost to install those BMPs and so they could generate credits. But we had another thing that was not associated with trading in the Lower Fox, which was a pending piece of legislation that said, well, $50 a pound. So we ended up modeling 3 farms. A couple of them were below $50. A couple of them were, one of them was above $50. And we just ended up going to a potential buyer and said, if I could bring it to you for less than 50, would you be interested in a trade? And it's that conversation that ultimately got us to a trade, our first pilot trade in the Lower Fox.
I'm salivating at $50 a pound.
I'm going to go ahead and read you guys the next question that came in. Thanks for that discussion. And it's directed towards Doug. Doug, can you please expand on your comments about cover crops and how this currently works or might work better for water quality trading?
Right. So the state of Maryland has a Maryland Agricultural Cost Share Program that's many millions of dollars. It comes from a number of different revenue sources in the legislature each year. Because we have such a large agricultural land base and a pretty strong sense that everybody wants to clean up Chesapeake Bay, this fund has been easy to keep full of money. Cover crops have been fairly well established by University of Maryland as a good practice to reduce nitrogen loads in particular, certainly phosphorus for any of the runoff that we carry sediment. And so the state put together, I would say, probably the most robust and lucrative cover crop program in the country. Many tens of thousands of acres covered in cover crops paid for at a fairly substantial price per acre by the state. So if you now start transferring a new revenue source in water quality trading programs to buy cover crops, that you can free up some of that state money either for more cover crop acres or preferably from our standpoint, some more permanent cost shares for agriculture, such as forested buffers along streams. So we're seeing the trading program as a new influx of revenue to enhance the existing incentive programs with more money and freeing up more of the limited state dollars to go further in load reduction, so that the net increase of load reduction from the participation of trading.
Great, thanks. Another question that's come in, and it starts with some praise, and you can all send us as much praise as you want. That's always good. Interesting presentations. Agree with Doug that trade should be regulated. Is pea trade currently regulated in Maryland or other areas of Chesapeake Bay and in Wisconsin, other Great Lakes areas?
So the only examples we have in Maryland right now are between wastewater treatment plants. They can trade phosphorus between their two NPDES permits, generally within the same watershed. There's similar allowances for trade between nitrogen and phosphorus. If one plant is particularly good at removing phosphorus, and the other plant's particularly good at removing nitrogen, they can trade those pounds because ultimately they're both discharging to the same water, and the net load reduction for both pollutants is equivalent. So that's being allowed under existing state regulations. There's not an actual trading program that does that. It's just recorded in the various NPDES permits, and those need to be synchronized to be within the same time period, and there's public comment about the distance between the two facilities and all that kind of stuff. So, but we are really looking at in the trading program addressing the currently unregulated sources of P, or the ones that are not being reduced within their permit periods because of the expense. We're definitely seeing, like I started my presentation, the low-hanging fruit's been picked for the easy and cheap P reductions, with a big P reduction still on the books that we have to do under the TMDL, and we really need to either regulate those other sources of P, which is pretty unpalatable, or the trading program is this market-based approach, which will result in better P reduction.
Yeah, and when you say regulating those other sources of P, are you specifically alluding to clean water regulation of non-point sources? Or?
So we have the phosphorus management tool regulation is starting with the most phosphorus saturated farms, which have a a fertility index value of 500 or more, which is like really super saturated soils. Those have already been, as of last June, required to stop all additional phosphorus application on those farms. As we phase in that regulation over the next couple years, farms with lower levels of phosphorus saturation will be folded into this. The phosphorus management tool looks at the general risk of phosphorus loss from the field to the bay and determines the level of phosphorus fertilization that can happen on each of those fields. So looking ahead, if folks wanted to do some nutrient trading to get below that baseline, or do some phosphorus load reductions on their farms to get below that baseline and begin trading, then when that regulation hits them as a farmer with lower levels of phosphorus, they'll already be in compliance. And so we hope that this will work well with our Ag Certainty program, which is a kind of a regulatory shield for folks who meet this baseline. So it's not only shields them from any further regulation, but the PMT regulation was kind of already in motion when that Ag Certainty program went into effect. So they can't shield themselves from being regulated under the phosphorus management tool, but they can meet that baseline early and trade credits before that would be required of them as the regulation phases in.
And Victoria, do you want to address the Wisconsin piece of this question?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question, but let me try to answer. So by virtue of it being a compliance trade, if a permittee is trading, it is regulated because permits are a regulatory instrument for implementing regulations. So the NPDES permits. To the extent they're compliance trades and they're reflected in a permit modification and there's a compliance schedule that incorporates trading, it's regulated.
Sure.
I think, I'm not sure what the commenter meant by should the trades be regulated, because it's the premise of a compliance trade is built into the regulatory structure of the Clean Water Act. But if it is like trying to bring in additional stakeholders to make load reductions to reduce their runoff, their phosphorus, or whatever it might be, TSS, that are not regulated, I mean, trading essentially steps in and helps to balance out where there are those inconsistencies in the market. So it provides incentives for the unregulated to do something that they wouldn't. If there were regulations on ag non-point, for example, they might not be interested in trading because they would just have to do it. But this way, they're getting incentivized to do it, and the permit holder is also benefiting by getting an alternative compliance option that is ideally more cost-effective for them.
Okay, great. We have one more question that's come in. And let's see, how are practices verified and current data costs in either jurisdiction presented? I'm not sure I understand the latter part of that question, but maybe one of you do. Victoria, you want to start with that one?
Sure. In the Lower Fox, we held several workshops with stakeholders to figure out who should do the verification. The DNR didn't want to be the verifier, and we landed on this county soil and water conservation departments, or land conservation departments, being the stakeholders agree that they would be a good verifier. They already go out and work with farmers to help them install these practices. They know the practices, they know the land. And importantly, the farmers trust them to come on their land and take pictures and take notes. They did want that in concert with random audit or spot verification by the DNR as the state regulatory body. So it's important to think about that. You could pick, an NGO or somebody to do the verification, but if you don't have access to, and you can't build that into the trade agreement, the farmer's got to agree to somebody coming on their land until such time as we rely exclusively perhaps on GPS technology, satellite technology, or drone technology, or something else. It's got to be a human being that goes there and watches and looks at things. So we have a form that needs to be filled out. Again, try to keep it pretty simple. You take pictures. Both of those get loaded up into a report. And how frequently depends on the practices that are part of the trade agreement. If there's seasonal practices, like you can't install a cover crop in January in the Midwest, so those have to be seasonal. If they're engineered practices, that might only be a once a year inspection to make sure they're still functioning. And so that's how verification is in Fox P, and that's also how it's being built into the Erie P Market, where the desire is to have a local entity that do the verification and use the same forms that we used in Fox. And then current data costs, I guess I would ask the questioner to clarify that.
Yeah, I haven't gotten a, let's see, okay. I don't think I've gotten a clarification yet, but if one comes through, I'll try to put it forward. I think maybe I did get this follow-up question from the same person, so maybe this is what they're asking. What are the costs of verification and who pays annual monitoring?
So the costs of verification depend on how you structure your agreement. If in the case of a land conservation department, they're a county entity, so they're a public entity. And we got an estimate of what their verification services would be, and we built that into the cost of the trade. So I think every program is going to have to determine that. Some programs around the country have independent third parties that set their own pricing, and those agreements are set up maybe not always in the trade agreement itself. It's a separate agreement. But somebody typically does have to pay, and typically that's the buyer of the credits in the systems that I've worked with. Annual monitoring. So monitoring and verification are two different things. Verification doesn't mean that the person who walks on the land and takes pictures and looks at the structures is doing any sort of scientific measurement. When I think of monitoring, I think of somebody actually going and doing water quality monitoring or edge of field monitoring. And those monitoring of that ilk is not required in either of the two markets that I've talked about. Although I did mention that sometimes universities will set up monitoring programs to help measure and see if the anticipated loads that are built into the trade are performing as expected. But they're highly variable conditions unless you have paired watersheds. Very difficult to monitor or edge of field monitoring systems in place, which are very, very costly, and you cannot put on every field. I mean, that would exponentially throw the cost of trading out the window. So verification is the way that the practices are validated over time, if you will.
Okay, great. Another question, I think this is a good one. Doug, maybe you can field this. Do peak trades refer to surface water quality only, or do they include groundwater?
Ooh, wow. Well, groundwater discharges are not very well understood as they're linked to surface waters. We know in the nitrogen world that we may have anywhere from days to decades of transport time from groundwater to surface water. From the P standpoint, one of the things that is part of the model smartness, if you will, is we know that agriculture in the coastal plain is generally in areas with high groundwater tables, and so therefore the fields are tile drained, essentially turning your groundwater into surface water, which makes it a little easier. If you are way further upstream, then the model is smart enough to know that you have your groundwater is attenuating most of those loads, and they're not getting to the surface water if either at all or over a very, very, very long time, to the point it would not enter into the model's temporal domain. So I think we've got in the geographic smartness of the model that idea built in, but we're not in the practice of doing groundwater tests or groundwater permitting to the point that we'd be able to track nutrient credits in that part of the water domain. It would be very, very difficult to do. But in as much as the groundwater becomes the surface water in short order, that is captured, and so we would capture the water quality benefits from the trades in that sector.
Okay, great.
May I speak to that for a
Yeah,
moment?
sure, of course, Victoria.
Yeah, so I mean, I would answer it quite differently. I would say there's surface and there's subsurface drainage. Tiles, the vast majority of the southern part of the Great Lakes region is tiled, but whether those tiles interface with groundwater is very variable. There are many farms and areas where there's tremendous subsurface tile drainage, but it doesn't really interface at all with the groundwater. It's because the groundwater table is far below that subsurface drainage. So groundwater is not directly captured in that, but I think Doug's point about tiles and the importance of tiles would just want me to clarify for the questioner here that what we have found, which sounds like it's different than the Chesapeake, our primary problem, we have reduced total soluble phosphorus, I mean, in the Great Lakes considerably, and we're still having hypoxic dead zones and harmful algal blooms as a result. And the primary culprit we've discovered is that the phosphorus is not the phosphorus that's attached to particles that's the primary driver of that. It's dissolved in the water. And subsurface drainage of tiles is a primary conduit for that soluble or dissolved reactive component. And it is a tricky issue, and it's one that one of the things that we changed between Fox P Trade and Erie P Market was we built our model to accommodate some of the tile drainage. But that's still a tricky issue, and I believe the NTT tool will be even more robust at that.
Yeah, and so you've actually segued great into my question I had, Victoria, which is lessons learned. I mean, you've just talked about something you learned in the Fox P Tray that you've now modified in the Erie P models. What other sort of missteps were made or were learning experiences did you have along the way that other people can learn from?
I would say timing really matters. So we had all these drivers in place, but the actual permit cycle and the reissuing of permits by the regulatory agency in Wisconsin were not lined up with the timing of our project and when we needed to execute trades. Now, again, this was we had a period of time where we were supposed to test this program. So we did end up doing a trade, but I didn't clarify earlier, it was a stewardship trade, not a compliance trade. And it was really, a lesson learned there was don't give up, because we were able to have a conversation with the treatment plant and said, you don't need this in your permit cycle right now, but you are a sort of a leader in terms of treatment facilities here. A lot of other smaller facilities are looking to your leadership. And if you can show that this process works, then you can be out of the gate and demonstrate it not only for them, but for yourselves. And now you know. And what we did, I I think really important, we worked with the regulator to draft what a permit model would look like for them. They said, we want to see what would our permit look like if trading was in it. And so we have parallel language to what a real permit would look like if it was modified. We provided that to them, and they have that for their record. Now it says draft it, but now they know. So that was a lesson learned, and that going back from that, we ran a series of what I would call hypothetical trades. So we got real farmers, real treatment facilities. We said, what are your load reduction needs? What kind of on the buyer side? What kind of practices would you do on the seller side? We matched them geographically, so we knew the trades were within the framework and the same geography, and they were doable under the guidance. And we ran test runs and ran draft contracts through them. And so A to Z, we said, but at the end of the day, we're not going to obligate you to sign unless you want to. Our pilot trade came out of that hypothetical process, but working with real individuals through all the nuts and bolts of what do you want to see in a transaction, how do you deal with risk, was incredibly valuable, because you can do all of this planning and paperwork and have all these drivers, but at the end of the day, it's people and what motivates them and their actions, and that's varied. And regulatory drivers are part of what motivates them, but it's not everything.
Yeah, and on that point, Doug, can you maybe talk a little bit about sort of maybe some of the political issues involved with setting up these programs?
Yeah, actually, Victoria started on this track, and I'll finish it. It's we have one particular sector that's the most promising for trading, and that's between the stormwater MS4s and the agriculture sector. Currently, the stormwater MS4 permits are expressed in % impervious cover reduction, which does not match up with pounds of phosphorus or sediment or nitrogen very well at all. There are some very tortured guidance documents that are very BMP specific for if a certain amount or volume of impervious surface is treated, that it has these reductions in the pounds of each of those pollutants. But from the standpoint of a waste load allocation for a permit, if it's not expressed in pounds, it's going to be very difficult to make trading work between the agriculture sector and the stormwater sector. So the trading program is almost underscoring and bringing to light the need for a change in the regulatory standard. And that change has not yet been made. The state agency is reticent to do that. Most of the local governments are shrugging their shoulders, thinking, why such a hang-up? I think it comes from the fact that historically impervious surface treatment and reduction had additional benefits for like bacteria, oil and grease, and other urban constituents, metals, that you may not, if you have this focus on nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment to meet the Bay TMDL, you may not capture those. So it's going to require a political shift in the way we view stormwater permits if any part of that waste load allocation is going to be met by trading credits. We're going to have to change the standards and the currency of how those permits are expressed. Every other sector already has their constituents separated by pollutant. The stormwater impervious surface standard just doesn't fit into that calculation very well.
Okay, great. I think we've addressed all the questions, so I think we can give people back their time. I just had a couple things I wanted to close out with, and first of all, I'd like to thank you both for spending the time putting your presentations together and working through this with me. And also, I wanted to, I think I've changed screens here. I wanted to remind everyone that we will be hosting a Phosphorus Form event in February in Tempe, and it'd be great to see all of you there. It's free for registration. You still have to fly out and pay for your hotel, but the cost for the event itself is free. So it's a good opportunity to exchange ideas with your colleagues and meet people from across the phosphorus value chain who are working on these very issues. So Again, thank you all for attending, and thanks especially to Victoria and Doug for taking the time. And we'll close it out there.
All right. Thanks, Matt.
Take care, everyone. Thanks.